Thank you. And Oren Cass, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very
out.
much.
And one of the things that struck me in it is a sober, smart analysis of tariffs, which we haven't had such a sober, steady discussion. It's been up and down and crazy. Tell me what your view of why it would help the American communities and workers if we did have, say, across-the-board tariffs.
Sure. I think the argument for tariffs comes down to just the basic idea that making things matters, which ideally wouldn't be a very controversial idea. But we went through this period where we really believed that making things didn't matter. It didn't matter what we make. There's a very famous economist who said, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference?
What is the difference? I mean,
one you eat, one powers your economy.
But literally, should we be focusing on what we make best, or should we?
Well, I think the problem is those things have very different economic spillovers, is the term economists would use. If you are good at making semiconductors, that has enormous implications for the other kinds of innovation you're going to have, the other kinds of products you can make that use semiconductors, military applications. We're seeing what's happening now with AI, et cetera, et cetera. If you're good at making potato chips, that's fine, but you sort of have a lot of potato chips. And so, essentially the problem is if you just say, well, we like the market, we just want the efficient outcome, markets don't care about things like what's the quality of jobs, what's the direction of innovation, what's the quality of your national security. If we do care about those things, then we have to find some way to force the market to consider it. And that's exactly what the tariff is, right? A tariff says something is going to be 10% more expensive if you want to buy it from somewhere else than if you want to buy it made in the United States. So if someone else can do it a lot better, then then that's still an option to you. If it's something that at the margin we could maybe do here, well, now there's a reason to do it here instead.
Well, the reason I started with tariffs is that it is one of the things at the core of this American compass, this whole new populism, conservatism that is focused more on workers, is focused more on communities, not sort of the old conservatism. You started with Romney, who I think of as an old conservative, meaning the traditional country club conservative. How did you make that move to a more populist conservatism?
I think it's a very fair description of Romney generally. The interesting thing is that it was not a fair description on trade. And probably my most formative experience in my own economic thinking was I was his trade policy advisor in 2012 and sort of brought him the standard briefing. Here's what a Republican says about trade. And he kind of was looking through it, all looked good. He got to the end and he looked at me and said, okay, but what are we going to do about China? And I remember we had some very senior accomplished economists in the room and they kind of looked perplexed. Well, we don't do anything about China. China sends us cheap stuff. That's great. And he had a business background. He said, no, that's not right. If you look at how this is actually playing out in our economy, this is doing real damage. And so I, as the kind of mid-level trade guy, got sent off to find, well, what else could we say? And I found that particularly on the right of center, but really on the mainstream left of center as well, no one had anything to say. There was no critical thinking beyond the sort of dogma that we adopted at the end of the Cold War, which is free trade is good, more free trade is better, and either the whole point of the economy is consumption and stuff, so as long as we're getting stuff, that's great, or we sort of had this story we told you lose some jobs, but other better jobs will come instead. And no one ever really kind of followed up to see if those jobs ever showed up. It was just kind of asserted. And that was when I realized, first of all, this was a problem. Romney was absolutely right. We had not correctly thought about what was happening with China. But also more broadly, this view of markets that had become so mainstream and accepted was just inadequate.
But don't you think you evolved from being the Republican Party, let's just say, has evolved from being a more traditionalist markets-based thing to this new populism that not so much Donald Trump, because I don't get Donald Trump, but J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and others represent?
Yeah, well, the Republican Party is definitely changing. In a way, I would say it's changing back. The Republican Party was always the party of tariffs. Abraham Lincoln was a tariff
Right, but
man.
they were not the party of the working man.
Well, if you go back to Lincoln, I mean, if you look at what Lincoln said about labor, I mean, if you go far enough back, if you think about, even Teddy Roosevelt, who then ultimately became a progressive in some ways, the Republican Party, at least with respect to how it understood markets, and more broadly how conservatives understood markets. Conservatives certainly like markets as the correct way to organize an economy, but conservatives and conservatism shouldn't have a blind faith in markets.
But do you think that conservatism did for a while celebrate the market more than what helps society?
Yes, oh, definitely. But I think this came about really with the coalition that Ronald Reagan put together. Mm-hmm. And the Reagan coalition had the social conservatives at its core, but he added to that, from one side, the sort of free market libertarian thinkers, and from the other side, the very aggressive foreign policy hawks. And what all those folks had in common was a deep commitment to defeating communism. And that was, we should celebrate, they succeeded, they did defeat communism. But that marriage of the free market libertarians and the merging of that economic thinking into the traditional conservatism, I think was always somewhat uncomfortable. I mean, it's, the sort of quintessential examples you always hear, Milton Friedman as an example, Friedrich Hayek is the example. Friedrich Hayek, one of his most famous essays is called Why I Am Not a Conservative. And what he says is, he is what he would call a classical liberal, is comfortable with what he calls faith in the power of the self-regulating market. That even if you don't understand why, you should have faith that the market is going to sort of find the right balance.
But you don't share that faith.
No, because it's not conservative at all. Why should we have faith in something like a market to do anything? Markets, we know they are a mechanism or a tool. They take the conditions around them and sort of give you an outcome. And there are some things that they really drive toward. They really drive toward efficiency, to getting costs down, to encouraging people to pursue profit. But nowhere in that list of things is supporting families and communities, creating good jobs, supporting investment in workers. If those are the best ways to get that efficiency and profit, people will do it. But if those aren't the best way to get the efficiency and the profit, if the efficiency and the profit comes from offshoring to China, from starting a private equity firm and buying and selling stuff and moving around in circles, then that's what people will do. And that's what we've seen in the last few decades.
What is the purpose of an economy?
Well, I would say abstractly the purpose is to support human flourishing. And I would say that human flourishing fundamentally comes down to the strength of the families and communities within which people are able to grow up and live and build those families of their own.
So pursuing great consumer goods, wealth, growth should not be number one.
No, not as an end unto themselves. To be clear, I like stuff, right? I'm not a let's go live in log cabins kind of guy. But I think it's important to recognize that not all growth, not all consumption is created equal, first of all. You can get a lot of growth that looks like just, rising wealth concentrated in a few industries in a few cities. And then you can say, oh, well, we'll tax those people and send checks to everybody else. But that's not going to support human flourishing. That's not what people want. And likewise, you can get lots of consumption. One of the fascinating things about the last few decades is, by our own terms, by what we said we wanted, we did succeed. Everybody's material living standards have gone up. People's houses are bigger. When you hear the litany, air conditioning, safer cars, more healthcare, it's absolutely true that people have more stuff. The market delivers that very well. But it did not deliver it in a way that actually provided good opportunities for people to build decent lives, raise families in the communities where they live. And that's what people say they want, and I think that's a much better definition of what we should be focusing on.
You said that the economy did create great wealth, but one of the things in your book was that the bottom 50% of households, I think maybe 20 years ago, let's say, had less wealth in 2019 than they did in 1989. Yep. In other words, if you were in the bottom 50%, you had less wealth. And if you were in the top 10%, you had, 29 trillion more. I'm looking at my notes there.
Yeah.
So it created wealth, but it didn't allow everybody to share in that prosperity. This is something, unless I get into a discussion of what is a traditional conservative, but this is something that the Republican Party generally hadn't put in the top 100 of the problems that they saw.
No, I think, in fact, you can find people arguing inequality is good because inequality drives innovation and so on and so forth. And what I think you see most folks in the mainstream right of center had been saying was that inequality just doesn't matter. There's a very famous clip from Margaret Thatcher around 1980 speaking in the House of Commons. She does this iconic thing with her fingers where she says of labor, you know, they would rather bring the poor down to here if it kept the rich down here than bring the poor up to here if the rich ended up here. And that was sort of the main...
In other words, inequality is fine if everybody...
As long as, yeah, if you want to know how lower income folks are doing, all that matters is this. This does not matter at all.
Was she right?
No. and she's wrong for two reasons. One is that, in fact, where you are relative to up here does matter to you. If you're going back to that definition of human flourishing, that it's not just stuff, you want to feel like you're a full participant and contributor in the community, that you're able to support yourself and your family, that you're able to attain middle-class security. And what you find when the other folks go up here is that, in fact, that pulls away from you. That it's these folks that tend to define what middle-class security looks like culturally. They tend to define what the cost of living is going to be. So if you think about healthcare as an example, the cost of healthcare keeps getting pulled up by what you can serve to the folks who can afford it. Now, from one perspective, you could say, like, well, you guys don't have less healthcare than before, but it doesn't matter if what you're telling somebody is, well, sorry, you can't afford the care that your family needs. That's just not acceptable.
So the inequality that's risen in the past, say, 50 years, corporate profits up almost 200%, wages up about 1%, right? So a basic inequality came from this market economy. How is that related to the backlash we're now seeing, the populist backlash?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think it's partly the backlash is just frustration that the deal did not work, that we were promised one thing and we did not get it. Because the promise was that the rising tide lifts all ships, right? If you actually got up as a politician and did the Margaret Thatcher thing as your pitch, right? You said, my policy is going to do this for the rich, but don't worry, everybody else gets this. Obviously, you would lose because that is not what anybody wants. What the economists and the policymakers across the political spectrum said was, doing this is going to pull everybody else up here too.
Were they lying or did they believe it?
I think they believed it.
Didn't they notice?
The didn't they notice is a better question, because I think one thing that it's fair, and this is something I find myself these days in a big fight over whether or not economics is a science. A lot of economists think economics is a science. Some will even tell you they are scientists. And I'm sitting there just like, it's not very good science, I'll tell you that much. And what I think you actually find is that economics is very valuable at observing and explaining what is in fact happening and helping you understand what is going on. And in the post-World War II period, the United States did have a market that was operating this way, right? What's good for General Motors is good for the country and vice versa. It really did seem to be the case that what benefited corporations and allowed them to invest and grow and expand was leading quite directly to this unprecedented growth and strengthening of the middle class, to unbelievable innovation, to better outcomes, to U.S. dominance globally, at least in the free world. And so I think someone like Friedrich Hayek writing in 1960, he kind of looked around and he said, like, there you go, the market's taking care of everything.
What messed things up, allowing China in the WTO?
I think that's a big piece of it. But I think the way to sort of think of it conceptually is that these constraints existed so that the things that were most profitable really were also things that served the society well. And partly because of bad policy choices, partly because of technological changes, we created all of these different opportunities to earn a lot of money. You see it in where people go from our top business schools. In the 1960s, where did people go from the top business schools? They went into manufacturing and consumer products.
Procter & Gamble and,
That's right.
General Motors.
Absolutely. Where do they go now?
Well, you went to consultancy.
Absolutely. I'm a perfect example. When, and I didn't even know.
Feel bad about it?
Well, I'll tell you, there are some of the projects that I worked on that I think were probably a lot better for the companies than for the workers. Conversely, the last project I worked on was fascinating. It was in the elevator industry. Elevator industry is one of the few industries that is still sort of sectorally unionized, meaning that all of the big players have the same contract for all of the mechanics. And so our project was a classic consulting project. It was our profit margin is this percent, we want to get it up to this percent. Typically, the first thing you would do would be to say, okay, where can we cut costs? Where can we outsource? Can we contract? Can we lay off? But because of this union contract, you couldn't. The workers had already been promised maintaining this workforce, giving them a raise every year. Because that constraint existed, the entire firepower of this consulting team was then dedicated for the year to figuring out how do we make these workers more productive? How do we get this company to grow with these good jobs we've already promised? And so, that is a perfect, and by the way, we did it. It's doable if that's what you have to do. But if you take away those constraints, if you just say, easier to make the money offshoring, easier to make the money, with a big cost-cutting product, easier to make the money taking on a bunch of debt and doing some financial engineering, the market tells people to do that instead.
Well, I think we're going to help confuse this Upper East Side audience by me trying to pin you down and saying, so you're in favor of at least sectoral unions in the industrial, which is not exactly a top Republican priority either, right?
It has not been for a long time.
Now you're going to go back to Lincoln and say that.
No, I was going. Well, I was going.
Not Teddy Roosevelt, but he was a trust buster.
That is true. In the 1950s, though, if you go back out and look there are these great, labor for Eisenhower, old campaign posters and stuff. Labor didn't used to be nearly as partisan an issue as it has become. And it was especially sort of what I would call the genuine conservatives, a guy named Robert Nisbet, who is the sociologist. He wrote The Quest for Community. He loved unions. Pope John Paul II, Catholic social teaching, loves labor. There's a recognition that you don't want a situation where labor unions just have all the power and are calling the shots, but that in a healthy economy, you want capital and labor to have equal countervailing power. That's one of the ways, if labor has all the power, they run amok in all sorts of ways. If capital has power, they run amok in all sorts of ways. If you can basically lock them in a room together and tell them the only way either of you are going to get what you want is if you find a way to work together.
And that only works if you have unionization in some cases.
You need some form of worker power. I think unions, because one funny thing, of course, about American unions is it's a kind of weird form of unionization. Like here in the US, we just assume, Norma Ray on the table with the sign that says union, that's how unions work. That's actually not how it works almost anywhere in the world. We think of Europe as much more pro-labor. Europe is right to work. There's no business by business. You have to have an organizing campaign, and if it's 50% plus one, now you're all in a union. Unions are much more institutions in civil society that employers are told you have to negotiate with. We don't care about your vote in your particular factory. You have to have a negotiation between representative workers and representatives of the firms. And then you can do all sorts of other things. We could have a long discussion about all the different versions, but what is interesting that I think you see a lot of Republicans now coming around to, this is why you have Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president, speaking at the Republican National Convention. Josh Hawley and Bernie Moreno in the Senate have done something very interesting. They've taken the PRO Act, which is this must-have set of Democrat pro-labor provisions that was considered dead on arrival, and they've just chopped it up. And they've said some of these things are sort of big labor wish list items we don't support. Others of them we absolutely support.
So is there a bit of a divide in the Republican Party where you have people like Josh Hawley, who, as you say, support most of what you've written about, J.D. Vance, I think, is in that camp, versus others in the Senate in particular, and how does that play out?
There absolutely is, I think, an interesting element of it that was captured in your others is that virtually all of the energy and momentum and interesting ideas from the rising generation of leaders is on this side.
The populist,
the much more populist
Vance Hawley side.
Yes, and what I would call sort of genuinely conservative in the sense that they don't have any patience for the libertarians, right? They look at that Reagan coalition and they say, we're just not very interested in what a lot of them, what I would call kind of market fundamentalism.
But wait, I always thought conservatism and belief in markets, maybe because I read Hayek and Friedman too much, that those were synonymous.
Well, believing in markets is very different than blind faith in markets.
Well, a lot of Republicans had blind.
Oh, no, absolutely, I agree. But that is, I don't think, synonymous.
And so you don't think J.D.
conservatism at all.
Vance and Hawley and others are blind faith marketeers, where some other Republicans?
No,
in
to the contrary.
administration are.
Very much. It's funny, J.D. Vance is sort of in a feud with the Wall Street Journal editorial board right now because he said, markets are a tool. They are a means to the end of the other things. And the Wall Street Journal was appalled. What are you talking about? The line was, the market just is. And like you said, that represents one view that has held a lot of sway for a long time.
Which side is Trump on?
That's a very good question. I would say that Trump is someone I describe as a sort of transitional figure in the Republican Party because he's clearly not on the old side. You look at trade as one example. But I don't think his thinking is motivated by the sort of new, different way of thinking about markets. I think he is a sort of much more pragmatic tactician in tackling the particular issues that he's seeing. But I think because he came on the scene the way that he did and showed that the old Republican thinking was not sacrosanct, right? Like, I still remember the first debate that he was in where, he said, like, we're not going to do entitlement reform, right? Like, Paul Ryan's bad. We're not going to do entitlement reform. The Iraq war was a disaster. Said it right to Jeb Bush's face. Everyone, like, gasped. Like, but Republicans love cutting Medicare and starting wars in the Middle East. And it was like, no, actually, Donald Trump was much closer to where most actual Republican voters were.
Well, let me pause for a second there, which is they do seem infatuated with cutting Medicare now, including Trump in the big, beautiful bill. Whereas Hawley is against that. Tell me, I know what my biography subject, Elon Musk, thinks of the big, beautiful bill today, but what do you think of the big, beautiful bill?
I think there are parts that are very good and parts that I
Name
don't
one.
like. Name one that's good?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of what they do on higher education, for instance, I think is very good. They are attempting to cut back on the public subsidies, particularly in the form of student loans, and forcing universities to have much more skin in the game so that you get paid back if your students, in fact, can pay you back.
You proved that you've actually read the bill, unlike most of us. But if
There
we're
you
getting
go.
to student loan reform, that's not a big and ringing endorsement of the big, beautiful bill.
Well, this is an interesting part of the Big Beautiful Bill is that by page numbers, the kind of top line tax and spending stuff is a small piece. So I do think it's important to recognize that a lot of the reason so many people in Congress are so excited about it is you have the immigration stuff, you have the defense stuff, you have the education stuff. If you're talking about just the tax and spending side of it, I think, first of all, there are some actually very important tax provisions that were good in the first tax cut and that we want to keep. And those are, first of all, the ones focused on investment. Some of them are very direct. You can expense your investment more quickly. That makes it lower cost and more attractive for businesses to do investment in the United States. That's very good. I think the larger child tax credit is very good. I think a lot of the other tax cuts, especially for higher income households, in an ideal world where we had infinite money, that would be great. Given the constraints we have, I don't think it's something.
I mean, you say it's only a small part, but that's 95% of all the money involved in this bill is whether you extend the tax cuts or not. And you're saying, yeah, there's some we want to extend, but we shouldn't be extending them all. And that could solve this issue, meaning you wouldn't have a $2.4 trillion deficit if you just said, let's only do some of those tax cut extensions. Is that where you would be?
Yes, that's where I would be. And I think what's been very interesting watching Congress try to move through this, first of all, it's important to notice how different it is than 2017, right? 2017, Trump comes in, Paul Ryan is Speaker of the House, and it's just, how big a tax cut are we going to do? And let's do the biggest one we can. And we're going to say it pays for itself, and we're going to say it's just be great for growth, and we don't have to care about anything else. This time, obviously, it's been a lot harder, even though all they're trying to do is extend something they already voted for. But you already see a shift. You see much less argument that this is going to pay for itself. You see a lot more concern about the size
Wait,
of
the
deficit.
president, the Secretary of Treasury, the head of this OMB, I'll say, oh, it's going to pay for itself. So you're saying they're not correct?
Well, while being kind to the head of the OMB, the case that they are making is a very strange and arcane case, which is, not to be boring, but it's important. They want to use what's called the current policy baseline instead of the current law baseline. So basically, all of these tax cuts are supposed to expire. Mm-hmm. If you accept that they're supposed to expire and then say, here's how expensive it is to continue them, well, that's a huge cost. What OMB has said is, well, but wait a minute, this year they're in effect. Next year we're saying that
but wait, let's just get to the basics. If you extend those tax cuts, it will cause a huge increase in the deficit and it won't pay for itself, right?
That is certainly my view. All I'm saying about the folks who are saying there is no increase in the deficit is they are not saying it pays for itself. They're saying we shouldn't have to count the deficit, which, again, not a good argument, but it does mark a shift away from just you can just cut taxes as much as you want. And I think the other thing that you then saw that was very interesting is you did see, first of all, you saw a number of folks, for instance, in the House of Representatives say, maybe we should bring the corporate tax rate back up a little bit. Maybe we cut it too much down to 21, maybe 25 would be fine. And then what you saw the president and Secretary Betzin say was, hey, maybe we should consider letting the top rate expire. Trump actually said he hopes Congress will do that. And what I think they were trying to do, because you're now in this moment where there is no clear party line, there are all these different factions, they're trying to figure out, okay, what is the shape of this that actually gets us across the finish line? And so one of the things they tested, they said, well, if letting the tax top rate go up would get us across the finish line, then we're open to that. Reality is there's a bunch of folks in the Senate for whom that's a red line, and if you do that, it fails.
Why is it a red line? Just because they don't want the rich's taxes to go up a little bit?
It's a good question. I think there are two sort of reasons for it. One is a substantive view that a lot of these folks have, and again, it's almost entirely people who have been there for much longer, sort of came up in the 80s and early 90s, which is what's called the starve the beast philosophy. And
but that didn't work.
I agree that it didn't work. But their thinking is any additional revenue that you collect, the Democrats are just going to go find a way to spend. So you're never actually going to address the deficit by raising taxes. You're just going to give Democrats more money to spend. We should be cutting taxes as much as we can so that there's no choice but to bring spending down. Now, the part of that I'm totally unsympathetic to is it's not true. You don't bring the spending down. You just end up with a big deficit. Part I am sympathetic to is that if you go to Democrats and say to them, okay, I think there could be a deal here. Let's say we actually do agree to bring some of these rates up. Which spending cuts are you open to talking about also? It is, in fact, the case that the answer is none. And I've done...
What do you mean? I mean, you don't need to get the Democrats. You need to get 5 Democrats or 6 that would say, I'll make a grand bargain with you. Hawley, John Kennedy, a few people who are okay with raising the top tax rate. They could say, we'll lose 5 of our dinosaur Republicans as long as we get 5 or 6 of you people. Is that a bargain that could be made?
Well, definitely not in the current environment. I mean, there's not going to be a Democrat voting for the big, beautiful bill under any configuration. And that's just, I mean, you see this even, Democrats historically cared a lot about labor and workers and domestic manufacturing, and they're now 100% free traders because Trump is for tariffs. And so just as a pragmatic issue in this negotiation, I don't think there's any room for that. Well, let's bring some...
Let me go back to tariffs because we've talked about Trump. Trump has done 2 things. He said, let's sort of have just across the board maybe 10% tariffs. But then he's done all these individual countries, 180%, and then the next day it's 200%, and then it's down, and it's like transactional, bargaining chip. Do you think both approaches are a good idea, or do you,
Well, I would separate China from everybody else.
Yeah.
I think with everybody else, what the administration is trying to do now is a good idea, which is, I think, look, they came out on that first day, Liberation Day, huge tariffs on everybody. That was too much. It was too disruptive. it didn't make any sense. You weren't going to make deals that quickly. Within a week, they said, okay, let's rearrange the order here. Tariffs are the consequence if we can't make a deal, but we do want to make a deal. So let's focus on making deals.
Well, let's take Vietnam then. Should we try to have a zero trade imbalance with Vietnam? Or is it better for us to have a bit of a trade imbalance? They're not going to be able to buy our stuff the way we buy things there.
Why not?
Why are we going to be rich enough to buy goods made in America?
But they don't have to be. I think this is a very common misconception when people think about
I specialize in common misperception.
Yeah. You have very well articulated the very well common misconception. If you think about the way trade works, and you go back to if you ever learn in Econ 101 about trade, they don't even think about the dollars going back and forth. It is a trade of stuff for stuff. And the classical models showing that trade works well assumes it is stuff for stuff. Now, in practice, you're not going to barter. It's a good thing that we have money. But by definition, anything we buy from Vietnam, we buy with dollars. They now have that many dollars. And by the way, a dollar isn't good for very much in Vietnam, which means they're going to have to spend it on something. Now, they can buy stuff from the US, which would be that actual, essentially, stuff-for-stuff trade. They can turn around and try to use those dollars in other forms of international trade. Or in a lot of cases, what they can do is turn around and use it to buy assets in the United States. So where the US has a big trade deficit, what it actually means is we buy stuff from other countries, and those other countries turn around and instead of buying stuff from us, they buy assets from us. They could buy our real estate, they could buy stakes in our corporations. A lot of times they're just buying treasury debt. They're lending the money right back to us, which is just a fancy way of saying we are now essentially consuming stuff on credit from Vietnam. So now this is exactly the opposite of what we should expect. Vietnam, the poorer country, should be trying to consume as much as it can, right? Instead, Vietnam is lending us the stuff, and we are doing the extra consumption.
Well, do you worry about the transactional nature of whether it be his trips to Saudi Arabia or the things he's doing with Vietnam, that it's all sort of a let's make a deal transactional thing on tariffs?
I don't know what the alternative to let's make a deal is. And this is one of the things that frustrates me about the purported free traders, is that they say that they are here just to support the free market. And then you say like, oh, cool, let me see one of your free trade deals, right? And it's 5,000 pages long, and the section on pharmaceuticals was written by the pharmaceutical companies. And somehow negotiating TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with Vietnam, and trying to come up with a 5,000-page agreement like the Obama administration was trying to do, written by the lobbyists, that's free trade. But Trump coming along and saying, wait a minute, this relationship is not working at all. We need to talk about what policy changes Vietnam is going to make so that we actually have more balanced trade. That's now the let's make a deal transaction. They're both let's make a deal transaction because you have economists out there who will say, no, the ideal policy is truly just free trade. You don't need an agreement, just open up your market. And if all you care about is consumption, and all you care about is getting as much stuff as you can, then, at least in the short term, that's true. If you actually want to have a strong economy that makes things, that's a very foolish thing.
I would suspect half of what I have on was made in Vietnam. I ordered from Amazon.
I was going to say Italy, but okay.
Yeah, no. Although this is my friend in New Orleans, but I don't know where it's manufactured. But if we don't have that, won't we be hurting our own ability to consume undershirts and underwear? And you think those should be made in North Carolina?
Well, I think more stuff should be made in the United States. What that stuff is, right, there are a lot of ways we could address these imbalances. One would be more of the stuff that we import, instead we make here in this country.
I was always against that, and David Brooks makes fun of that. I was actually in Grand Rapids a couple of days ago, and two things struck me that were counter. One is that it's kind of hollowed out because Amway and everything it used to support it. The other thing is they're making a lot of furniture. Steel case is there, Kroll is there, whatever those fancy chairs. And there's a lot of manufacturing. And they said, yeah, we can do more manufacturing in America. Is that your goal, to have just communities like Grand Rapids where people have companies and manufacture things?
Yes. Sounds great. I think it's important to say manufacturing is never going to be, most of the economy. We're going to be a services-based economy. But manufacturing as an anchor in a regional economy, partly as a provider of good jobs in those factories, but also up and down supply chains, the suppliers, the customers, the logistics and transportation, the energy, the infrastructure, all of that comes with making things. And then when you do have that factory that makes things, you have more productive workers earning better wages there, well, now the job at the pizza parlor in town becomes a better job. Now the services economy can thrive too. The problem is if you shut down the factory and take it away, and you're just left with the pizza parlors, you can't all make pizza for each other. That's where it falls apart.
You were kind of diplomatic when you talked about the big, beautiful bill. You said it had some good parts, like student loan reform or something.
We covered the tax parts too.
But let me read something where you were a little bit harsher on it to bring you back, which is, you wrote, this bill is a messy hodgepodge of conventional conservative priorities, which you mean not as a compliment, that won't do much to help working class constituencies that Trump was supposed to help. So you actually think, on balance, there's those fundamental problems with this bill?
I think so in two respects. One is I am frustrated that this is occupying as much of the oxygen as it is. I think if I were prioritizing the things that would be year one of the Trump administration, there would be more focus on the education side and the non-university side. What are the alternative pathways? There would be more focus on what we typically call industrial policy, where there's something we really care about, like chips. How are we supporting more investment in it? There would be more focus on trying to figure out what we want to do with labor, doing family policy, all of these other things. And instead it feels like we are sort of back in the standard rut of, well, a new Republican has taken office, what's the tax plan going to be?
And another of your criticisms of this bill, I hope you don't mind me quoting yourself, but you said it has a slew of decidedly unpopulist provisions, and you even say rollbacks to Medicaid coverage and cuts for food assistance programs you think is bad. And I always thought it was, whatever your politics are, it was a bit unseemly to have the richest people in the country starting by hurting the poorest people in the country, saying, we can make Medicaid cuts and make it harder to get Medicaid, and that means poor people won't get as much health care, but that's good for spending. Are you against that strain of the Republican Party that says, let's cut food assistance, let's cut Medicaid?
So not really, which may surprise you, because I'm supposed to be some different kind of conservative. I'm not against welfare or support on principle. I like that we have a strong safety net. I also think our spending is too high. And particularly with COVID, it went way up and did not come all the way back down. Mm-hmm. And if you look at where we are in terms of how far above norm spending is and how far below norm tax collection is, we're definitely going to need more tax revenue to get this right, but we are also going to have to bring spending down. And some of the places where we saw the biggest expansion, some of those biggest buckets, where I do think there's room, and just given our constraints, we're going to have to find some savings, are on food stamps, are on Medicaid. But I don't understand the idea that we would do that and take that savings and not use it to close the deficit, but use it to pay for a tax cut. And so one of the reasons I think it's so important to say, particularly the tax cuts for the highest earners should be allowed to expire. First of all, it's just, we need that revenue. But I also think that as a political matter, if you are going to say we need to be making cuts in Medicaid and food stamps, which again, I believe we do, you have to pair that with saying, and we need to ask for some more from the folks at the top as well.
This is the one place in Manhattan where I've been able to go 42 minutes without people asking about Elon Musk, and then the first question in the pile. But I'll give it to you.
Well, as a biographer of Elon Musk, I have several thoughts.
Is the rift between Trump and Elon Musk today a rift between two people, or is it indicative of a falling out between two parts of the Republican coalition. In this case, I don't think the questioner means populist versus traditional conservatives. I think it's the tech right, the tech bro right versus the populist right.
Yeah, this is a great question. I want your thoughts on this also, but I will say a little bit about what's going on, I think, within the Republican coalition, which is, we've talked about some of the folks who, in a sense, are being pushed out. The free market libertarians that were part of the Cold War coalition, the aggressive sort of neocon hawks that were part of the Cold War coalition. What makes it powerful is that others are being brought in more quickly. You're bringing in more of a multi-ethnic working class voter, a labor base. You are bringing in the more sort of technologist. They're kind of libertarian, but mostly focused on tech, I would say. And you have the kind of Maha folks. There's a lot of interesting groups that are sort of trying to figure out, okay, who gets what? Does this actually fit? And I think in some cases the answer is yes, it can actually fit very well. We were really proud. We had our big 5th anniversary gala on Tuesday. The two presenting...
This is American Compass.
Yeah, American Compass. The two presenting sponsors of the gala were the Foundation for American Innovation, which is a very tech-focused think tank, and the Teamsters. And this captures perfectly what I think is true, which is that if we are going to succeed, we have to find a way for those two groups to see what they have in common, that they need each other to succeed in a sense. But I think you also have, when you get to an extreme like what we had with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, a facet of the tech side that really is incompatible. Incompatible. And I think
we noticed that today.
And so I think there's obviously something very specific with the personality of these two guys that it did not take, Freud to see might
Freud would help, actually. They both have daddy issues.
Freud would, well, okay, so I'll pass it over to you then. But the point being, I do think it is symbolic of what is going on in the politics, which is there is the potential for a broad coalition here. There's also a lot of testing of where the limits of it are. And you saw back in December that Vivek Ramaswamy with his, sleepover rant was on the outside of that line. And now I think you're seeing Elon Musk with some of his priorities might be outside of the line.
Yeah. Well, I think it is a policy thing with Musk, first of all, meaning he really, really hates deficits. It's just something ingrained in him for a long time. Secondly, he really hates tariffs. So he's had a double whammy there. And he hates the transactional view of Washington. He wants things simple and clean. But it's also a lot more there. I mean, it's two personalities. Musk has never worked for anybody before and never got along with colleagues, and Trump has never shared the limelight. But more importantly, when Musk was talking to me, was writing the book, he said, and I put it in the book, even though I think he wanted me not to, he said, I've met Trump. He's a charlatan. He's a con man. He's a liar. He's a fabulist. And then he paused and he said, he's just like my dad. And Elon has this conspiracist right-wing father who Elon doesn't speak to now, but they have this tumultuous relationship, Elon Musk in South Africa and Elon. And in some ways, Elon found it's almost like Luke Skywalker figuring out Darth Vader and the dark side of the Force. They found this bond together, but it wasn't going to last. And I didn't think the blow-up would quite be as bad as the last 4 hours have made it be. But it was clear that none of their priorities were aligned, and especially on the deficit, which people don't really believe Musk really feels that way, but he's just fanatic about the deficit. So,
interesting.
Yeah. How can we shift the narrative within the American right regarding climate change?
It's a good question. This is actually, when I first started doing policy work, this was one of the issues I was most interested in, because it seemed to me a classic example of a place where the right of center, because it did not want to grapple with what role government might have to have in addressing a problem, was preferring to just argue about whether there was a problem. And I think you saw that in a lot of cases. Climate change is an obvious one. I think you saw it on poverty, where there's like, well, everyone has opportunity, so that's all we need. In a sense, it's what you saw in trade, where, look, well, free trade benefits everybody. We don't have to have any policy past that. But climate change was obviously a big one. And I think, you've started to see, well, I think you've significantly seen at this point a shift on the discussion of the underlying issue. I think there's very little of the sort of, and again, Trump is sort of unto himself here, but in the Republican Party broadly, there's very little of the bring a snowball to the Senate floor kind of thing. I think there's much more an acknowledgement that, yes, climate change is happening, yes, there are going to be costs associated with it. The question is then, and this is the healthy debate to have, okay, but what are the responses that actually make sense? And this is where I think actually conservatives have a lot that's very constructive to contribute to the debate, both in insisting that we take a hard look at the actual cost-benefit analysis, somewhat within the United States, but even more so recognizing that the United States does not drive climate change alone, and the United States has essentially no control over what the rest of the world does.
Well, we tried to have some influence through the Paris Accord process.
Which was
Well,
but the Paris Accord was a total failure, if I may.
I like Paris, but I don't, yeah.
Paris, I'm sure, was lovely, and what a coincidence that the world's diplomats all chose to jet to Paris to talk about solving climate change. If you look at the commitments the developing world made, they were in every case to do nothing, continue with business as usual. And especially in a place like China, that has been the case at every stage. China's commitment has always been basically that their emissions would peak when the analysts thought their emissions would peak anyway. And I think this is an entirely rational choice by the developing world, by the way, given the energy poverty that they still have, the priority for just getting more energy, electrifying in a world where the only technology that we have that a developing country can deploy reliably for baseload power is typically coal.
So let me ask what you would do. If you believe climate is a problem, what is the economic populist approach you would take?
Well, I think there's two things. I think one is there's a lot more investment in trying to actually find new, better technologies. I think one real frustration that I've had is how much of the focus went into wind and solar, which if you're the United States and you're trying to get your curve to look a little better, can get your curve to look a little better. If you're asking how is Pakistan going to get first world levels of power to 200 million people, wind and solar are not it. And I think you see, even folks like Bill Gates ultimately came around and said these technologies we are throwing all of our resources at because they look good here do not actually solve the problem. I think something like nuclear is much more likely to be a plausible solution, and we are finally starting to see, and funny enough, not because of climate change, but because of AI, people coming around and saying, wow, maybe we need to get serious about nuclear. But I think it's that kind of innovation and accepting that we don't have the solution yet, but we should be looking for solutions. And I think the second thing that is just very pragmatic is that we should be relatively much more focused on adaptation. That I think, relatively speaking, our capacity to adapt to the changes we expect to see from climate change is much higher than our ability to actually prevent the climate change from happening. And so anyone who has a good policy that can cost effectively provide the developing world with ways to avoid building coal power plants, I'm open to. But in the absence of that, buy a Tesla, put solar on your roof, it's basically the equivalent of eat your vegetables because children in Africa are starving.
The new American right looks in some ways like the new American left, according to this. What differentiates new conservatives from progressives economically or populist progressives in the Democratic Party? And is there a potential for a new bipartisan consensus?
I think one place where there's a lot more consensus and is a very good thing is on the diagnosis. I think in a healthy politics, you can ideally agree more often than not on the facts about the actual world, what the situation is, what problems people have. We were just talking about this in the climate change context, and then you can disagree entirely about how to rank those problems and what you think appropriate responses might be. I think one reason why people are noticing a lot more commonality in the way the new right is talking and what they hear from parts of the progressive left is because the new right is coming around to much more of an acknowledgement that these problems exist economically, that markets did not magically solve everybody's problems. In a lot of cases, it created problems. Where I think you still don't see a lot of commonality generally is on, okay, therefore, what should we do? You see more than you used to, which is nice. I always think of it as like, we had this particular political alignment that had sort of dug into just total trench warfare by the late 1990s, and no more progress would be made, nothing was moving. And what folks now call this sort of political realignment, where you have more of a working class Republican Party, it's essentially almost sort of like an attack coming from a different direction. And that creates new opportunities. And this is where the metaphor breaks down, because it's not an attack, it's also an opportunity to find common ground. All of a sudden you find things that people haven't been fighting about for 30 years, they actually do agree on. And so like the CHIPS Act, hey, we should actually be investing in building semiconductor plants in the US again, was bipartisan.
What Democrats do you like?
What Democrats do I like? It depends on the issue. I think, in the House, there are actually some really interesting folks, particularly Jared Golden in Maine and Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez from Washington, both of whom I think are sort of very genuinely focused on the same sorts of working class issues that I'm focused on, that we're focused on American Compass. And, I think conversely really see within their own party some of the ways that some of the more progressive positions certainly distract from, in some cases ultimately conflict with things that they need to focus on. In the Senate, I think it's much more sort of issue specific. You'll find, on an issue like industrial policy, there were lots of senators who were involved. On some things, on criticizing the financial system, there are things I agree with Elizabeth Warren on labor-related issues. There are things I think John Fetterman's very good on, and so forth. So I think and you see this in, J.D. Vance was known for this when he was still in the Senate, the number of bipartisan bills he was a co-sponsor with a Democrat on. Same with Josh Hawley. There are a lot of interesting overlaps. At the same time, I think what you see is, I'm always very skeptical of like the healthy, moderate, third way, milquetoast solution, because the reality is that tends to be like exactly what the elite editors of newspapers in New York and Los Angeles think the answer is. And in fact tends to be, whether you think the left's answers are better or the right answers are better, these are like the worst of all worlds, more often than not. And so I actually like that we have a much more kind of healthy contestation now between a left and a right that are both talking about real problems that exist and are trying now to make different cases about, okay, but what is the actual goal here? What do we want? And you see from the new conservatives this much stronger emphasis on family, community, industry. And I think you see, my view is you see from progressives a much stronger view on and priority given to sort of personal autonomy and liberty, which is fine. We used to more kind of think of that as being on the right. But a great example of this, where I have very big disagreements with folks on the left, is what's called the care economy. And I think a big focus of folks on the progressive left is to look at all the places where sort of life gets in the way, if I could say it in an unfriendly way. It's like, raising kids is a burden, dealing with elderly parents is a burden, and these are therefore problems to be solved by government programs that instead take care of those things. And I look at that and I say, first of all, the term care economy is bizarre to me. It's like, well, we're going to somehow if only the market could solve the problem of taking care of the other people in our lives. But also just more fundamentally, it seems to me that human flourishing and the good life is about equipping people to fulfill their obligations, not relieving them of their obligations.
How do you think about the relationship between your wing, I'll call it the new conservatives, you, Vance, Josh Hawley, and Steve Bannon's populist nationalism?
I think there's a lot of overlap. I think most of the new conservatives are quite nationalist in their orientation. And I think of nationalist as a kind of very value-neutral term. There's obviously a way that nationalism can tip over into unhealthy politics. But there's obviously, I think we have seen ways in which a lack of nationalism, a more sort of globalist outlook can tip over into a very unhealthy politics. And so I think what you see, and a lot of the new conservatives, Marco Rubio has been talking about this a lot in terms of kind of what an America first foreign policy looks like, I think are rightly saying, look, the nation has identifiable value that's really important to that conception of human flourishing. That ultimately, and this is again where conservatives are so different from the free market libertarian model, there's something we really like about the nation as a sort of forcing function of solidarity. That the nation matters in part because there are a whole lot of other people out there who are actually legally committed to go out there and die for you. And that's a really good thing. And with that should come the idea that you in turn are committed in various ways to care more about what happens to those people than to what happens to a random person, somebody else in the world. That if just to say one more thing about it, that if you eliminate the focus on the nation, the idea of sort of we must care equally about everybody very quickly becomes I don't have to care about anybody.
And finally, the person you're most associated with and your movement is J.D. Vance. And I think people have trouble, at least in this zip code, getting their heads around him. What does he really stand for? They may have read Hillbilly Elegy, but then he's up with Trump. You had dinner with him on Tuesday night. You spend a lot of time with him. Tell me how he fits in to the Trump orbit and to what you think this new conservatism should be.
Well, he's obviously a very important figure in what's going on in American politics and certainly on the right of center. I think what makes him so fascinating to me and significant is that he got very mad at me for saying this on Tuesday, that he actually was a sort of intellectual first. That typically your very best politicians, you're excited because they actually understand ideas and care about ideas, right? But at the end of the day, there's still people who are sort of looking out there among the ideas and seeing which one they're going to pick up. Vance was part of this very small cadre of folks that developed these ideas, that was making the arguments before anybody else was. It was at the bar late at night arguing with other people about it. And so I think he understands them and is committed to them in a way that's very uncommon in our politics. And I think you see that in how effective he is in articulating them. I mean, love him or hate him, I think most people would admit he did, he crushed Tim Walz. I don't know a lot of people who are like, well, that Tim Walz sure knew what he was talking about. And you see it even, with the frequency with which they'll send him out into these long-form Sunday show interviews. The only politician I can ever think of where sometimes you feel bad for the interviewer. I mean, he's not there trying to think through his talking points. He's not there trying to remember what's the answer to this question. He lives these arguments. And so I think, people typically with lenses shaded by their political priors will make of him what they will, but I think it's very hard to deny that on this thinking, on this core set of issues about what conservatism should be, what matters in the country, what the role of government is, how we should think about markets, it is almost certain that he has thought about them more deeply than you have. And that he has very strongly held beliefs and that he is in politics and doing what he is because he wants to move his party and the country in that direction.
Well, let me just end by saying I actually read the book. It came out this week. And if you want to know more, you really should get this book. It is very nuanced, great set of essays. You have essays not just by yourself, but by some of the others in the movement. And it certainly has helped provoke my thinking, because I don't come at it from the same place you do, but it's every single chapter, whether it's the one on people, whether it's the one on work, whether it's on communities, is worth it. So I'm making the pitch, buy the book. Thank you, Oren.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to do this with you. I appreciate it.